So thank you, Jessica. For the introduction and also for this invitation to speak today in the Chainbreakers event and to share with all of you a little bit more about and wider and the work that we do integrating direct worker reporting into global supply chains to drive social impact. So I'm going to begin with a basic definition of what direct worker reporting is. And we describe it as an anonymous insight that's direct from workers about worker lives and well-being. And we gather this insight through mobile phone surveying. So what And Wider offers, we have a couple of different ways that this technology goes out into global supply chains. One of them is remote monitoring of working conditions and worker well-being. We also use it to enhance virtual assessments and audits and gathering anonymous data directly from the workers. We use it as of last year. One of our pivots, actually, interestingly enough, was to create remote monitoring services that were gathering data on the impact of COVID-19 on suppliers as well as their workforces. It's also used to monitor the impact of COVID-19 on stay-at-home workers. So not only using it in factories, but also within retailers and large-scale companies that have teams globally that used to work in office spaces and now have team members in their homes, which brings a whole other dynamic to their working conditions. And lastly, it's also used particularly for monitoring small suppliers. So in the global supply chain, we often use audits and they don't always make it to the smaller suppliers. And so a digital platform is really useful for gathering insights from small stakeholders too. So before I spend more time on specifically what we do and how we do it, I wanted to talk a little bit about why direct worker reporting is needed so intensely in this time. And to do that, we have to kind of take stock of where the industry is currently and how we operate, and really look at what data sources are used to monitor working conditions in global supply chains. So most prevalently used across the board are supplier self-assessments. And these are assessments that the supplier themselves completes and sends in to the brand or retailer or buyer. And they're used very widely, particularly when onboarding new suppliers. They're a great way of getting baseline information about what management systems a supplier might or might not have. This data is given by the supplier, so it generally does not require any consultation with workers themselves. And it can give a very high level overview of the capacity of a factory or supplier. For internal audits and third-party audits, we're referring to cases where there might be an internal team member of a brand or retailer that goes to the site of the factory and performs a social or environmental compliance audit, or an audit is conducted by a third-party audit firm. And in this instance, the data that's captured is gathered by the auditor, and it's cross-verified based on evidence of document review, record verification, observations on site, as well as worker interviews and management interviews. And lastly, I've included also the investigative reports and exposés. This is generally how the public or the consumers get insights or information about supply chain issues and working conditions. And historically, the investigative reports have essentially been the foundation of what's triggered a lot of monitoring of supply chains. A lot of the early exposés that were exposing child labor and sweatshop conditions were what initiated the social compliance industry, which created the audit model. Now, over the years, this has created some conditions that unfortunately have driven issues underground. particularly because it's a model that's based on risk mitigation, specifically risk mitigation for the brand or retailer. And when we're looking at working conditions, we very often expose very vulnerable populations of workers, very challenging issues that brands and retailers might not be prepared financially or reputationally to engage with, and therefore might be motivated to leave the factory. And so within these current models, a lot of the motivation to look at working conditions is to avoid the risk for the brand, as opposed to understand the opportunities for improving the lives of workers. One other dynamic of this existing model, and this is in the context again of audits and self-assessments, are that there's barriers from getting candid and clear insights from workers. Some of these barriers are related to the context in which the workers are used to being engaged. And so in the context of an audit, as I just described, there's a lot of pressure on suppliers as well as buyers to have 100% compliant audit results. This is in order for the buyer or brand to be able to report publicly and say how responsible their supply chain looks. And it's also for the supplier to be able to secure customer purchase orders from brands and retailers that have a high expectation of compliance performance. So as a result, this puts a lot of pressure on the supplier to pass the audit. And unfortunately, this means that in some countries, in certain contexts, there's a lot of pressure then put on the workers, and management might coach workers about what to say to auditors to ensure that they give the right answer. For me, personally, I've worked in this space for 15 years, and I've worked in a lot of different layers of the industry. I've worked with workers, I've worked with suppliers, I've worked with brands and retailers in developing their programs and training their suppliers, and then also in the world of auditor training. And one of the really intense challenges for an auditor is that they have to build trust with the worker in a very short period of time in order for that worker to give them information that helps them discover the realities on the ground. This is a very technical skill that not every auditor has, but it also is difficult because the auditor themselves is in a position that they're unable to promise the worker that change will actually happen after the audit. So unfortunately, many workers who have worked in factories or on farms for more than a decade, they might have been audited multiple times. The workers may have been interviewed for multiple audits, and yet they haven't seen a direct change in their working condition in a way that matters. And in some cases, it might have actually gotten worse as a result of them sharing in the worker interview. So very often auditors are challenged with workers not wanting to be candid with them. This is also connected to cultural barriers that we're dealing with in a face-to-face contact. So as I just mentioned, workers have to build trust, auditors have to build trust with workers in a very short period of time. And there might be some cultural nuances, gender dynamics, hierarchical conditions that might stop a worker from feeling as though they can share vulnerable information with an auditor. There's also the very real fear of repercussions. And workers, essentially, this might be based on a rumor, this might be based on a threat, this might be based on direct interaction with management. Perhaps they received a pay docking, perhaps a worker who shared something during a worker interview was fired. All of these aspects create an environment where the worker is disincentivized to share candidly during an audit worker interview. And then finally, many workers lack access to or faith in existing systems that are already in place that are meant to open up channels of reporting, specifically grievance mechanisms. This is a big challenge where very often factories will have a grievance mechanism in place, but the workers aren't using it. They might have a worker committee, or they might have a union on site, and yet the workers themselves don't feel the worker representation is really offering them a channel to share their voice and their perspective. And therefore they don't engage with those existing systems. So that's where we come in with direct worker reporting. And we do so in order to offer a safe channel for workers to report about working conditions candidly. And we assure this safety through the 100% anonymity, the ongoing tracking of needs, and measuring impact over time. So the way in which we roll out our call cycles allows a consistent dropping in to check on things as they're moving, as opposed to kind of a one-time audit once a year that gives a very narrow glimpse of day-to-day working conditions. And then finally, we take a shared values and improvement-based perspective for suppliers and buyers to receive worker insights. And I'll talk a little bit about this further down, but it's very, very important that we consider the approach that we take when we engage suppliers and buyers in this process of listening to workers. So going back to the worker trust, our system, the design of our system is based in the foundation of building this worker trust. And we do it in a number of ways. We are always communicating to the worker why, how, and what's next. We also always ensure anonymity in the system. Workers are able to opt out. So it's an opt-out system, which means we'll call the entire workforce, and each worker will have to give permission to participate. They have to decide that they will participate, and if they don't want to, they can opt out. As I mentioned, we do regular calls, so we always recommend our clients do a minimum of 2 call cycles, up to 4 call cycles a year, so that again, the workers begin to build trust in the system by seeing the consistency in which the channel is being opened and their insights are being asked for. We also integrate a reward. We do try to incentivize their participation, and we take a regional approach to this, understanding what an incentive means to a workforce in one village in India will be very different than the approach that we might take in Peru. And then lastly, we also encourage this bigger picture engagement. Whenever we share the results with the supplier, it's also under the encouragement that they share them directly with the workers themselves. Because what we're trying to do is build a much more coherent communication channel within the supplier so that workers begin to trust other ways of sharing candidly and don't just need to rely on direct worker reporting to do so. So very briefly about our main tool, which is called Engage, and how it works. We do a 5-minute phone call. As I said, it goes out to the entire workforce in the factory or on the farm. It's done in the language that the worker selects. So we have no limit on the number of languages that can be used for the site. In the onboarding phase, we gather all of the languages and have everything translated in advance and pre-recorded. It's 20 questions that are always simple, single, literal. And this is one of the key aspects of the survey design in order to create a survey that's accessible and ensure that workers are not made to feel intimidated if they have a lower degree of education or feel that they don't understand the question. As I mentioned before, anonymity is key. This is critical and one of the key aspects that's missing in our other data streams for gathering insights about working conditions. The workers only press 1, 2, or 3 to respond to questions. So they'll never be asked to speak into the phone. And this is to limit the risk of coaching or threats from management. And it's a mixed response. So they won't answer. 1 does not always mean yes, 2 does not always mean no. it's mixed so that it can never be traced back to the worker which response they input. And then we present the data in a really simple dashboard that's easy for the supplier and the buyer to understand what priorities are key to the workers. This is an example of how that dashboard would be presented. And so you can see in terms of the response, these higher priority issues are the issues that came up for more than 50% of the workforce that responded to the survey. We also present the data in a way that allows suppliers with multiple sites or buyers with multiple suppliers to have this bird's eye view and understanding of where they have sites that are dealing with high priority issues. This is particularly helpful when we have clients who are realizing and starting to see trends of certain priorities in specific regions. So for example, a buyer or retailer who has a capacity building budget and program for their suppliers is very easy to look and see, okay, we need to do more gender equality training in these particular sites here because we've got all of these suppliers are showing up with this specific issue and priority. The last point that I wanted to bring into this space that's quite unique about our approach and something that we believe is fundamental, especially in the context of working on issues such as forced labor, is inviting a change of approach to supplier engagement. So much of the existing model around audit is focused on policing, discovering what's wrong and requiring that it gets fixed and becomes compliant. And this is a very different approach to what we're inviting, which is appreciating what's actually working very well and then imagining opportunities for what could be even better. What we found over the years is by taking the top-down policing approach, while this does have a positive impact on certain issues, such as specific health and safety and management systems issues, for the softer human issues, particularly forced labor, harassment, discrimination, abuse, these tend to get pushed to the side or pushed underground, and they're harder to find during the audit. And so even a supplier who might have the management system in place and might be passing an audit with flying colors could still have issues of subtle forced labor occurring on their site and not even be aware of it. And so when our system opens that view and that lens and gathers the insight from workers themselves about their experience, we want to take the appreciative approach of what that supplier's already doing that's working and bring the priorities in as the opportunity to really make improvement that will have an impact over time. And so one of the ways that we do this is how we share the information. And so with each call cycle, the supplier and the buyer are able to see the progress of responses and how an issue is becoming less of a priority or increasing in prioritization as different workers or more workers engage with the system, and as a supplier begins to take action and begins to respond and make changes on site. So bringing this back to ultimately keeping our focus and our view on the opportunities for impact rather than only focusing on risk mitigation, what we're invited to do is move beyond the cycle of blame and alarmism and reactivity that's fundamentally embedded in risk mitigation and evolve sustainability approach, compliance programs, all types of monitoring, so in a way in which we're able to listen to workers to gain clarity about their priorities and track that progress and improvement in order to enable responsiveness that's geared toward impact. And that responsiveness coming from the supplier, but also from the buyer, from multi-stakeholder initiatives, and from a much broader collective that's working on critical issues so that we can actually move the dial on some of these really, really challenging dynamics that workers face every day. So with that, I am ready to pause and join all of you for a live Q&A.